In this lesson, we will continue our discussion of how an auditor justifies their reliance on internal controls by testing them. The methods we can use as auditors to test controls vary. Inquiry of client personnel is one possible method we can use to test a control, but is generally not a very strong source of audit evidence. Inspecting documents and records along the audit trail for evidence of performance of the internal control procedure is a much stronger source of evidence. Keep in mind that as we test controls, we are looking for evidence that the control procedure has been performed. We're not trying to substantiate a balance or an amount per se, so if the key control is that the payables clerk matches a receiving report, a purchase order, and a purchase invoice prior to preparing the payment, then we would be looking at a sample of these documents looking for evidence of the three-way match. A third way to test controls is to observe the control activity being performed. If the control is undocumented and there's no evidence, this may be the only way that we can test it. However, it's harder to verify that the control operated throughout the period using this method. Test data is a way of testing computer controls that we've discussed, which means we feed in dummy data into the computer system to ensure that the computer system processes the data according to the controls documentation gathered. And last, we can reperform the client's control procedures ourselves. In our earlier example of the three-way match, we looked for evidence such as a stamp on the invoice indicating that the clerk performed the three-way match. However, using a reperformance method, we can reperform the three-way match ourselves. The extent of testing of the client's internal controls depends on our assessment of control risk. The lower this assessment, the greater the reliance, and hence the greater the amount of testing and evidence required to support this reliance. Does that make sense? The results of our control testing are fed back into our risk assessment. If the test supports our initial assessment, we continue on with the execution of the audit plan as scripted. However, if the tests do not support the control risk assessment, then we'll need to circle back and reformulate our audit approach for this area. When this happens, there's often a deficiency in the internal controls noted. Our first step might be to consider whether a compensating control exists. A compensating control is another control that exists elsewhere in the process that offsets the weakness. If there is not a compensating control, and we legitimately have a control gap, we will document the weakness on a separate working paper. This working paper will discuss the potential misstatement that can arise and any effect on the collection of substantive evidence. This is referred to as a control matrix working paper. Significant internal control deficiencies are communicated in an internal control letter to the audit committee or its equivalent in the company. Management letters are a similar sort of communication. However, the control deficiencies identified and discussed in this communication are less significant and would be communicated to management to point out areas for improvement. The common way of communicating deficiencies is to identify the deficiency, talk about the implications, and then propose the recommendations to close the gap. So there you have it, what you would need to do before you can rely on internal controls. Now, a couple of finishing points before we close off this lesson. First, sometimes we will purposely assess control risk at maximum for efficiency purposes. For example, if a balance or a transaction cycle can be more easily audited using a substantive approach than a combined approach, then we can limit our work on internal controls to gaining an understanding. We then immediately move into the substantive procedures. And finally, one last point. Let's put a bow around this whole group of lessons on internal controls by reviewing the overall approaches to the audit one more time. And of course, we have two, the combined approach or the substantive approach. Under both approaches, we need to obtain an understanding of the control environment and the system of internal controls, which enables us to make our assessment of control risk. This is done on an overall basis and on a transactional cycle basis. Under the combined approach, we believe there are efficiencies to be gained by relying on the strength of the client's system of internal controls. If this is our approach, we must test the controls to support our reliance. The results of the tested controls may or may not impact the rest of the audit depending on the results of our findings. Then we move on to do substantive audit procedures, which we would hope would be generally less because we've tested and relied upon the internal controls. Under a purely substantive approach, we would assess control risk at maximum. And this would take us right into the substantive audit procedures, which would generally be greater than had we done more work on the internal controls. It's taken us a while to get to this point in the course where you're beginning to see how all the pieces of the audit fit together. This won't be the last time we review the different audit approaches, so if your understanding is still a bit fuzzy, hang in there. And remember, don't stop till you get to the top, and when you get to the top, don't stop.